A little bit to start off with, the whole carcass is one of those things that we used to see moved around the country, utilized a lot in different forms or fashions instead of now primals and subprimals. And when we start talking about primals, subprimals, individual muscles, those kind of things, you probably need a little definition of those. So we start with the whole side here, and as we look at the side, there's four major primals: the round, the loin, the rib, and the chuck. When we start talking about minor cuts out of the carcass, we'll talk about those more on the belly side of the animal through here: the flank, the plate, the brisket area, and the foreshank. Those would be considered minor primals out of the carcass, the round, loin, rib, and chuck being the major ones. When we talk about a subprimal, we're actually talking about if we took this rib, the whole rib, and took just the ribeye roll out of this portion here. That would be a subprimal. When we start thinking about subprimals from this carcass, if we just go to subprimals and we start looking at those, this top sirloin, the strip loin, the rib, and looking on the inside, beneath this kidney fat that's in here, the tenderloin, are those four cuts that are most commonly used at a lot of food service operations. When we start talking about the sirloin, that's where we're going to get those top sirloin steaks. When we talk about the strip loin, we would get New York strip, Kansas City strip steaks, those type applications or steaks from here. If we took the tenderloin out, those would be tenderloin steaks. Now we could do something a little differently if we didn't have all boneless applications. We could actually take the whole area of the loin here that would be referred to as a short loin. And if we did that, you could actually cut across the bones and the muscle here to make porterhouse steaks, T-bone steaks from this area as it goes down, and the tenderloin gets a little smaller. So we could do one or the other. You can't do both off the same side. And so packers work on both of those and make both of those all day long, essentially, from different sides of the animal. Then if we look at the rib, the other major subprimal or primal out of here, and we took a ribeye roll out of here, we could cut ribeye steaks from this area, and we could also use this whole portion here if we were making prime rib. Now you can see on this carcass there's already a separation made between the loin and the rib. That's done between the 12th and 13th rib, or the only place on the carcass that it can be officially graded is between the 12th and 13th ribs. And so we take a saw and saw through the bones. Then we use a knife to complete that cut to do what we call rib the carcass, which just means separate between the 12th and 13th rib. When we do that, besides exposing this ribeye for grading, we've also then separated the carcass into a hindquarter and a forequarter. And really the forequarter is a little heavier. It's about 52%, and the hindquarter is about 48%. But it's almost splitting the carcass into equal quarters if we think about then there being 4 quarters of a beef carcass. When we get the forequarter on the table, we start to be able to start to take some of these cuts apart. So we've kind of done that so we can use this for demonstrative purposes here. If we start on this, one of the first cuts we made was to cut between the 5th and 6th ribs to separate the chuck from the rib and the plate, and also separates the brisket. So we've done that. When we did that, we also then came in and made another cut to separate the rib from the plate, And we came between the edge of the first rib here and made a straight cut out to separate the brisket from the chuck. So those are some of the major breaks we would do on a 4/4. The outside skirt is really the diaphragm. It's this muscle that separates the two major cavities inside the beef carcass. It comes between the area where the lungs and heart would be and the stomach and that area of the carcass. The inside skirt is a second muscle that's been utilized for fajitas. Actually runs up into the hindquarter as well. And so you can see we've already loosened it from the hindquarter, but it's called the inside skirt because it is inside the body wall. You can kind of look and see some of the different aspects or different things about the rib. First off, there are 7 ribs left in a rib, a whole rib primal, because we did cut between the 5th and 6th, and we had already cut between the 12th and 13th ribs to use this end of the rib for our grading application. We're going to start taking apart or fabricating this full rib. To do that, we're going to start to take some of the bones off of there to get down to some of the more commonly utilized subprimals or the types of ribs that you'd normally see coming out of some of the plants. To do that, the first thing that would be done is we would take this chine bone or the body of the vertebrae and we would remove that with a saw. And so we've already done that to expose some lean between the rib bones and some of the feather bones that are attached on the other side. After we do that, we would come over from the other side of this cut and we would remove some of the muscles that are over the top of the ribeye itself. Actually, if you see it, if you look at it from this end, you'll be able to see that better. Because you can see these muscles that a lot of times would be referred to as cap and wedge meat or lifter meat. Have some of those names and have some utilization from using them for cube steaks or maybe some stew meat or something like that, maybe even some kebabs. And we'd be able to take those off. There's a nice seam that allows us to just remove those over the top. When we do that, we also expose another piece of real heavy, thick connective tissue. The scientific name for that is the ligamentum nuchae. And it sits in here. It's very tough, hard to do anything with. And so we remove that to, again, get down to those steaks and prime rib that we might be able to get out of this that would be real user-friendly. So when we do that, we've got a cut now that on this end includes the ribeye muscle, that cap muscle over the top called the spinalis dorsi, plus several other smaller muscles that are peripheral there as well. We look at the other end of the cut. Again, this is that end we used to grade, is mainly just the ribeye muscle itself, a little bit of the spinalis muscle or that cap muscle showing up there just a little bit. We still have bones on the bottom side of this. And a lot of times this cut, the way it's cut right now, would be referred to as an export rib or a 109E export rib, something like that. This could be used for prime rib. It can be cut into bone-in rib steaks that you might be using there in some application as well. Our next step will be to take the bones off of this and get to a lip-on ribeye roll. As we move from the export rib to a boneless lip-on ribeye roll, there's a couple of things we do. First, we actually came in on the back side or the bottom side of the rib and removed the rib bones. Now normally these would be sold as back ribs And packers may not always do back ribs. They may actually come in and remove the finger meat in between those and just sell bones and lean. But for the most part, you'll see a lot of them sold as back ribs. We'll also come in and do a couple of other things. One, we need to make the tail on these no more than 2 inches from the end of the ribeye muscle itself. So I've already done that and made this cut about 2 inches long. So it was a little longer than that. We'll do that on both ends of the cut of the subprimal to be sure that we're only about 2 inches. And normally you'll see this cut as a 112A lip-on ribeye roll. And when we say lip-on, what we're really referring to is this length of the tail from the end of the ribeye muscle to the end of the cut. So that's the lip-on ribeye roll. As we start to break down the chuck into various subprimals from the chuck, one of the major ones that would come off the outside of the shoulder is the shoulder clod. And so that's what we have here is a shoulder clod. And from this side, you can't see a lot of differences, but just so you understand, this is the outside of the animal, kind of the outside of the shoulder portion. I'll turn it over, and we can look at several muscles. One of the interesting things about a shoulder clod, we've always talked more about the muscles that are involved in locomotion, movement of the animal, actually being somewhat tougher. That still holds true to a point, but we found some muscles within some cuts, some subprimals like this shoulder clod, where actually there's some very tender portions of this that could be used for a lot of different applications. One of the ones that used to just be cut in half and never really utilized much is a little muscle that runs right here. It actually would have set close to the blade bone, or the shoulder blade. It's called the teres major. It's a very tender muscle that is shaped a lot like a small tenderloin in shape and can be used for some kebabs. It could be used and braised and or grilled alone and used. A lot of different applications for that. The muscle fibers all run one way. If we turn around and look at the muscle that was on top of the shoulder blade, which happens to be this muscle right here, is the infraspinatus, or the top blade muscle. And it is a kind of an interesting muscle. Right down through the center of it is a heavy layer of connective tissue that if you cut across and make steaks, stays right in the middle and won't cook up all together, although it kind of will on one end. If we though, instead of doing that, take the muscle and almost fillet it out, leaving the muscle tissue out of the center, or taking the muscle tissue out of the center, we can cut steaks across this that we'd use, and most of the time those are referred to as flat iron steaks. So flat iron if we take out the fillets of that, top blade if we cut across. So that's just a little difference in terminology. The remaining portion of this shoulder clod can be used for several things. Some of it would just come out as either stew meat or something like that. The major portion, the triceps brachii, which is this muscle right here, could be used for a roasting application, could actually be staked, but they're not going to be as tender as the top blade. I didn't mention, but the top blade actually, in muscle tissue tenderness, is second only to tenderloin in muscle tissue tenderness. So it is extremely tender, where these others would be kind of medium in tenderness. Some of the other muscles or other subprimals out of the chuck, one of the other major ones would be the chuck roll. And that really is the extension of the ribeye. Remember, we cut between the 5th and 6th rib, so you can see the mirror image of the chuck end of the ribeye right here. Still has the same muscles, and a lot of times this would be referred to as a chuck eye. Okay, as we look, a lot of times this cut, and it would move up through here to the neck, a lot of times this, at this point in time, is either cut into steaks or cut thick for roasts. Now, there are some applications going on right now where we're taking this apart by taking this chuck eye out of the center, taking a couple of other peripheral muscles off, leaving a center portion or a flat portion of this that would be utilized either for like a brisket, could be used to cut across the grain to make some steak cuts, or different applications like that. So this is going to eventually will be kind of one of those that may be left behind as we seam out these muscles further and go a little further down to single muscle cuts. We talk about single muscles. Another portion of that chuck roll was this muscle. That's the supraspinatus muscle. So the infraspinatus was that top blade that's very, very tender. On just the other side of the ridge of the scapula, we had this muscle. A lot of times it's referred to as a mock tender. And the reason it's called a mock tender is this muscle has some tenderness issues and tenderness challenges. A lot of times it's fairly tough. If, however, we take them out like this, when we know they have some tenderness challenges, we have more opportunity to create a product with these, like a pre-cooked, slow-roasted pot roast that will help with tenderness issues from this cut. When we're talking about the hindquarter now, we again go back, and that's about 48% of the carcass. It really includes two major primals, the round and the loin. And then it also has a minor cut there, the flank. So those are the three major ones, or the three cuts out of the hindquarter. When we start talking about looking at each one of those and making a break, remember we separated this end of the loin between the 12th and 13th rib. We separate this end of the loin from the round between the 4th and 5th sacral vertebrae, and right in front of the knob of this bone here, which is part of the hip structure. Once we get those separated, we can start working through some of the pieces that were in there. First off, from the flank, we've got a couple of muscles. One of them kind of transcended the loin and the flank, and we've removed it, called the flap, which is kind of an interesting name. Sometimes it'll actually be referred to as steak tails. It kind of functions about the same way as our skirts did. So it's in that same category, long fibrous muscle fibers that transcend the cut itself. Also in that area is the rectus femoris, which for the most part we use as flank steak. And you can see the fibers of that cut run the length of the muscle, and is a cut that is used a lot by food service for different flank or applications with the flank muscle that can be rolled or tied or roasted or braised, or a lot of different applications for that. When we get on the major muscles of this loin, we're going to start to take those apart. Again, we could do this two different ways. First off, we could come in right here between the last two lumbar vertebrae and cut this into a short loin section and a sirloin section. We could do that and then use this short loin, as you'll see later, cut into porterhouse steaks, T-bone steaks, and finally off the front we may get a strip steak or two as the tenderloin begins to narrow down to its attachment. So we could do that. Today what we're about to do is we're going to come in and take the whole tenderloin first as one whole piece. It's about 1.5 to 1 3/4% from the carcass. So it's a very small piece, but it's the most tender muscle in the carcass and obviously is in very high demand. We will then be able to take the rest of this short loin section, take the bones out of it to make a strip loin that we'll cut strip loin steaks from. When we start to fabricate the loin into boneless, closely trimmed cuts, and not the short loin that we'd use for porterhouses and T-bones, but the actual just boneless cuts, we have that done for you here and kind of tried to put it back together so you can see the various parts. Again, we're looking on the inside of the animal here, and we removed this tenderloin. We talked about the tenderloin being big on one end, narrow as it goes down to the other end. And you can kind of see that here. It's only about 1.5% to 1.75% of the carcass again. It has two muscles in it, two major muscles, actually has more than that, but it has the psoas major muscle, which is the major muscle in the tenderloin, and the psoas minor, which is a lot of times referred to as a chain along the side. There are a couple of other muscles up here in this end, and normally we call this the butt end of the tenderloin. As we come back then and remove the tenderloin, we're able to get to some of the bones that are in here. We can remove this vertebra that was there. A lot of times it will be referred to as the chine bone. We can also, off the sirloin, remove this big portion of the hip, big part of the hip bone, which gets us down to a boneless loin. From that, we can remove some other small bones in here to get to the strip loin, the whole strip loin, which you can see has the same shape as our ribeye muscle on this end. It'll have an added muscle, the gluteus medius muscle, which is really the center portion of a sirloin, we'll see in a minute, up here on the top. Sometimes this end will be referred to as the vein end of the strip. The tail on these could be, are various, but on this one we've made it 1 by 1. So if you hear those numbers, again, we're talking about the length of the tail from the end of the longissimus dorsi or the loini ribeye muscle here on the end. Okay. So we move back in the animal, we have the sirloin. We've found a seam in between two muscles. Actually, you may be able to see it better from the side. We removed the bottom sirloin, which includes the ball tip, bottom sirloin ball tip. And you can see just the tip of another muscle here that normally is referred to as the bottom sirloin tri-tip. It's triangular in shape. From that, we have the top sirloin, which is the portion that's left. If you notice on this, there's the gluteus medius, the major muscle in the sirloin, and the biceps femoris. The gluteus medius has muscle fibers that run toward you. The biceps femoris has muscle fibers that run side to side. So to make these more tender, one of the things that's done is to remove the cap, the biceps femoris muscle. If we use it now, we can cut across the grain to make it more tender. By doing that also, we isolate one major muscle, the gluteus medius, by also removing some accessory muscles. And so now we can cut steaks across this way. We can separate it into portions and cut thicker steaks according to portion size. But we're down to a single muscle that can be utilized for high quality sirloin steaks.